Good morning and welcome to the sixth meeting in 2020 of the Finance and Constitution Committee. Can I put out the usual message about your mobile phones, please? And the first item on our agenda this morning is to take evidence on the budget at stage 2. This is intended to allow the committee the opportunity to put questions on the bill and its amendments to the Cabinet Secretary and their officials before we turn to the formal proceedings on stage 2. And we're joined for this item by Kate Forbes, who's the Cabinet Secretary for Finance. And Kate Forbes is joined for this item by Scottish Government officials Andrew Watson, who's the Director of Budget and Public Spending, Graham Owenson, who's the Head of Local Government Finance. Obviously, I welcome our witnesses to the meeting, and I just wonder if Kate Forbes wants to make any opening statement.
Thanks. I'll just make some brief comments that will cover both sections of the meeting. So before turning to stage 2 amendments, I want to again put on record my thanks to the committee, both for its report on the budget, to which I responded yesterday, and also for the constructive and flexible approach that the committee has taken to this year's budget process. As committee members will be aware, the truncated timetable continues, with the principles of the budget bill having been agreed last week, and consideration of the Scottish Rate Resolution will take place in the Chamber this afternoon, and then stage 3 will follow tomorrow. Convener, the amendments have two broad purposes. There are 5 amendments to give effect to the budget increases that were agreed with the Green Party that I outlined at stage 1, and there are also 15 amendments to update Schedule 1 of the bill to reflect the revised ministerial portfolios. And as I confirmed to Parliament on the 26th of February, as a result of the agreement with the Greens, I'll be providing an additional £95 million in resource to local government, an additional £60 million for the transport, infrastructure and connectivity portfolio, which consists of £15 million of resource to introduce new free bus travel for young people aged 18 years and under, subject to the necessary preparations, and £45 million capital for net zero projects, £15 million of which will be transferred to local government. There's also an additional £13 million of resource and £5 million of capital to the justice portfolio for police services. So overall, those amendments increase the Scottish budget by £173 million, which is £123 million of resource and £50 million of capital. And I outlined the source of that funding in my letter to committee on the 28th of February, but very happy to take questions on all of the above now.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. In your initial budget proposals, you included, I think it's the sum of £468 million of anticipated Barnett consequentials. And you told the committee on the 12th of February that your anticipated consequentials had been fully allocated within the budget, and therefore there was no more resource because every penny had been deployed. But then you told the committee that since the budget has been published on the 6th of February, it's become clear that additional consequentials of up to £43 million are due to the Scottish budget in respect of the fossil fuel levy, and revised assessment in respect of wider UK consequentials has been made as a result. So I'd like to know when and how it became clear that additional consequentials would be due, and when did you decide to carry out the revised assessment of the wider UK government consequentials?
Thanks, Convener, for the question. As members will be aware, in order to provide certainty to ratepayers and also to public services, I needed to secure safe passage of the budget, which required me to find agreement with at least one other party in the Chamber. And although parties were very forthcoming with what they wanted to see, with some exceptions, they were slightly more hesitant in terms of where that money would come from. So I therefore had to review the assumptions that were underpinning the budget and set out how the agreement with the Green Party was to be funded in my letter to committee on the 28th of February. So in particular, there was some late information that emerged when the UK government notified English councils of provisional non-domestic rates information. That was too late to inform the original budget proposition, but we've since analysed the implications and taken it into account. And specifically on the fossil fuel levy, we were contacted by Ofgem with new information on the 18th of February, and that has informed our current position. as members will know, the budget has taken place in exceptional circumstances. There has been a higher level of risk in light of the fact that we'd already baked in anticipated consequentials, and so we are exposed to whether or not the UK government delivers on its manifesto commitment. But clearly, I needed to revisit those judgments and assumptions in order to deliver a budget.
Okay. You mentioned the word risk yourself, Cabinet Secretary. I'd be interested to understand what you think the extent of that risk might be, and if that risk produces any shortfall in funding because the funding doesn't materialise as anticipated, how you would intend to deal with these circumstances.
Well, indeed, when it comes to risk, there is always a judgment call. And I think the context is quite important in that regard, because the risk of not delivering a budget at all and creating huge uncertainty for ratepayers and public services, I deem to be a higher risk than making the judgments that I have about funding sources. But there will always be a degree of risk when making assumptions and relying on forecasts. Under the fiscal framework, that now applies to a larger proportion of our total budget, including the assumptions that are built into the block grant adjustments and forecasts of tax receipts and social security expenditure. So I think the assumptions that I've made as part of the funding package need to be seen very much in the context of the wider risk that is associated with this particular budget in light of the fact that we're going before the UK government. So, as I've already said, if the UK budget, for example, delivers less than we have assumed, we may need to review our position. It's worth bearing in mind that there may be a number of fiscal events this year that have an impact on the Scottish budget. So I believe that the assumptions that we've made are prudent and within a level that could be addressed through routine budget management processes. But I also don't want to hide the fact that there is risk, because we are more exposed to the risks of what the UK government does or doesn't do this year versus previous years. But we have, I think it's lastly worth noting that in light of all that, we have considered and included different sets of assumptions in order to spread the risk. So the approach I've taken draws on a mix of funding sources: underspend, NDR pool, fossil fuel levy, and assumptions about the UK budget. And that means that if there is some variation in one area, then the hope would be that the mix of funding sources mitigates that risk and certainly spreads the risk and reduces our exposure.
One of the risks, obviously, Cabinet Secretary, might be around coronavirus. And obviously there are significant concerns about the outbreak of coronavirus and its impact it could have in Scotland. And clearly the primary concern is in relation to health and the impact that could have on people. However, there's also the potential to have a significant impact financially. And there have been reports that the Chancellor is reassessing his budget in the light of the coronavirus outbreak. I just wonder, what discussions has the Cabinet Secretary had with the UK Government on this matter about any potential funding to help support the response that the Scottish Government will necessarily need to make in response to the coronavirus outbreak, not least, of course, in terms of the area of the health budget, but I know it will affect all sections of life and will no doubt have an impact on the economy.
Notwithstanding the obvious serious human impact, it is something that we are very mindful in terms of ensuring that we make the appropriate preparations in our budget, as well as in terms of what the NHS are doing. I had a call with the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, Stephen Barclay, last week. I believe it was on Wednesday, if I remember correctly, and I raised it with him then, because I think it's really important that we have that we're able to share information and have an ongoing dialogue in terms of funding. It's not yet clear, and he wasn't able to provide me with any clarity, how the UK government will respond to that in its budget next week. Never mind how it's responding now in terms of potential funding and consequentials. But I have a quadrilateral next week on Tuesday. So along with Welsh and Northern Irish counterparts, we're due to speak again to the Chief Secretary of the Treasury next Tuesday. And it's on the agenda. And I'm very happy to keep the committee informed of associated funding developments as they evolve.
Yeah, I think that would be pretty important, just to let us know as soon as you can about where this might be going, particularly as we said around the challenges on the health budget, at least immediately. So any light that you can throw on it after your quadrilateral next week will be very helpfully received. And given that I know we'll be discussing health as part of today's discussions, can I turn to Angela Constance at this stage?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, I'm aware that during the Stage 1 debate that you spoke about how the Health Secretary had identified £10 million of resources within our own portfolio to increase the investment in tackling the harm caused by drug misuse. And I wondered if you could provide more detail on the source of that funding and importantly, how it will be spent.
Thank you. So, as Angela Constance said, I announced at Stage 1 that the Scottish Government was making available additional funding of up to 20 million to help reduce the harms and deaths caused by drug and alcohol use. And that is an increase of £7.3 million from within the health portfolio itself. So that's money that Jean Freeman has identified within her own portfolio on top of the initial proposals that were in the draft budget. And whilst, of course, it's for Jean Freeman to talk to health spending, that will help deliver the recommendations of the Drugs Deaths Task Force and also provide investment for mental health support. It'll also allow wider consideration to additional NHS-funded rehab beds as well. So that means that for 2020-21, in terms of next year's budget, Scottish Government and NHS funding for reducing the harms from drugs and alcohol use will rise in total to £95 million.
Okay, thank you. Obviously, tackling inequality in all its forms is an important part of the budget, and I wonder if you can speak to the overall contribution that your budget will make to supporting low-income households, but also helping Parliament to meet its child poverty targets. Bearing in mind, to meet our targets, we have to move beyond mitigation and not just prevent people from going backwards, but we actually need to lift them out of poverty.
This coming budget is quite a critical year because whilst we have been investing in mitigating the worst impacts of UK Government welfare cuts, next year sees the first payments being made in terms of the Scottish Child Payment in order to put money directly in the hands and the pockets of eligible children and families. And so our spending plans will most certainly be supporting low-income households. Previous estimates have suggested that we expect to spend at least £1.4 billion in total to mitigate the worst effects of cuts and tackle child poverty head-on. And that includes the £21 million of the Scottish Child Payment. It's also still got £110 million to mitigate UK Government welfare cuts, including almost £60 million to mitigate the bedroom tax and over £180 million to close the poverty-related attainment gap in schools. So it's certainly a budget that is delivering or trying to deliver on one of our 4 key strategic aims, which is to tackle child poverty head-on.
Okay, thank you. And my final question, Convener, is I'm conscious that COSLA and others in arguing for increased resources that has resulted in 95 million over and above the draft budget going to local government. And I know that 50 of that comes from a reprofiling of the non-domestic rates income distribution. What I'm interested in is that the calls for that additional resource were principally, as I understand it, around the climate emergency and child poverty. And I know that the money is non-ring-fenced, and I'm supportive of local decisions being made and local accountability, but I just wondered if you had any sense of what that additional resource, in relation to child poverty, where that would be directed to and whether it would be around mitigating decisions made elsewhere or whether it would be on measures to lift children out of poverty, just bearing in mind that we're accountable for our targets, and we need to understand when investment is mitigating to prevent people going backwards and when investment takes people forward.
So I think it's quite important to stress that that 95 million isn't ring-fenced, so it will be for local authorities to determine how that money is spent. But when it comes to COSLA working in partnership with ourselves to deliver common aims, we are obviously both signatories of the National Performance Framework, and one of the outcomes or indications of the National Performance Framework is tackling poverty and inequality. So my hope certainly would be that that funding is used, and it's resource funding specifically, that funding is used to support the families and the children that rely on public services the length and breadth of the country. We are stepping up considerably our efforts to tackle poverty, and that's why we have the Scottish Child Payment in place, and we have to work closely, not just with COSLA in fact, but with every public body, I would suggest, to do that, because I don't think any organisation can tackle that in isolation. So it needs to be a streamlined, joined up approach to dealing with poverty.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Angela. There's a number of members who I know want to ask questions about support for under-19s using the bus services. So I'm going to I think we'll just deal with all that in a one. Alex?
Thank you very much, Convener. I'm just wondering what climate change assessment went into this, because obviously giving free travel for those who don't drive already might have less impact than the current removal of bus services that we're seeing in rural areas, particularly the North East, and I'm sure across the rest of Scotland.
I think this is a profoundly valuable policy change to not just meeting our climate change targets, but also to supporting young people, particularly in rural areas, where as somebody who started working in a rural area when I was a teenager, spent the first hour's wage on just getting to my workplace. So I think this will be make a huge difference to young people the length and breadth of this country. But it's important to say that we've made the commitment that we have as part of our agreement with the Greens, and we now need to get moving on the preparations and the due diligence that is required. So Transport Scotland is urgently developing project plans to deliver on the commitment, and 3 initial work streams have been identified in order to explore how best to deliver it. And I think it is important that we do that work in partnership with young people. So we do that work in partnership with young people in rural areas and urban areas to ensure that it delivers the improvements they want to see in public transport.
I think my point is that if the bus service itself is being cut in the rural areas, it doesn't matter if you've got free travel or not if there's no bus.
Services are cut because they're not viable in some form. Sometimes, as someone who represents a rural area, I'm very aware of it. Sometimes they're not viable because they're not used well enough, and they're not used well enough because they're too expensive. So my view would be that in the same way that you've seen the take-up of bus services amongst the over 60s, you would see the same thing amongst young people, where when there's a choice to be made about driving, if they've got access to a car, or just staying at home and not getting to a sports tournament or getting to a youth club or coming back late after school because of extracurricular activities, they can now choose to do those things and are able to use the bus. And I think the more people that use the bus, the more viable the service. The more viable the service, the more likely is those services are going to be retained.
Yeah, thank you. And just finally, you mentioned a bit about the preparation. I just wonder what consultation happened with the bus companies before the announcement, and not just on the overall policy of free travel, but also in coming up with the £15 million preparation figure.
So in terms of the costings, that's done in partnership with Transport Scotland. So the costings are to try and understand in advance of making any announcement. But bear in mind that this has come out of budget negotiations and a budget deal. So those conversations are private and confidential, and I'm sure every party appreciates that. So when it comes to what we are engaged on, we obviously need to identify as much of the detail as possible, but I was very clear in my letter that there is still some work to be done in terms of making the appropriate preparations and conducting due diligence to ensure that what we do in this space works.
Thank you.
John, I know you were interested in this too. Alec Rowley.
Yes, thanks very much, Convener. I have to say I'm very grateful for my card, which gives me at over 60 a lot of opportunities to go on the buses. I mean, will it just be exactly the same, really, for young people, or are you suggesting that there might be a different what they get for that? I mean, I get free bus travel, I get a reduction on the train in Strathclyde, I get to go on the subway for less, these things?
Well, there's obviously, at the moment, there's a Young Scot card-based, non-statutory young people's bus discount scheme in place already. So, you know, we will have to, I can go into detail on the 3 work streams that we're proposing in order to ensure that preparations are done. But there is some flexibility on how it's rolled out. Ultimately, we want to ensure that it's easy and straightforward for a young person to be able to get on the bus and to use the bus. And it may involve building on the discount schemes that are already in place, so we're not starting completely from scratch.
Okay, and I mean, the £15 million that's been mentioned, I accept inevitably there's a bit of uncertainty about the timing of this because as to when you've done all the work. But I mean, does that include, if it does get going next January, that would be, what, 3 months in this financial year, this coming financial year, that there would be some kind of cost in there as well as setting up the scheme?
So that, if it were to start, which we would hope on January 2021, then the funding that we've put aside in the budget this year would meet the preparation work and also the commencement of the scheme this financial year, or next financial
So a full year would be
Yeah.
a bit more than that. That's great, thank you.
You want to go in other areas, but I'll come back
That's
to
fine, no, on
I'll come
buses.
back to him. Alec.
Specifically on that, I mean, 50 million, who knows what the full cost will be. I mean, where did you get the figure for 15 million? And will you be able to publish more information on the work streams themselves and how we tend to take this forward? Because I think there are a lot of legitimate questions. I mean, my colleague mentions the fact that you can have a free bus pass, but if there's not a bus comes in your area, and particularly, as you know, in rural Scotland, that is a serious problem. Councils, as their budgets have been cut, have been less able to subsidise bus routes, and bus companies have been pulling more and more bus routes off, particularly in rural areas. So is there not a sort of more holistic approach that needs to be looked at? And the powers are now there for local authorities to be able to set up public bus companies, but the resources are not there for them to do so. So is there a need for a more holistic look at bus travel, public transport in general? A number of councillors, I don't know if they've contacted you, but I've certainly had contact for quite a number of councillors asking me that, will that then mean that there will be a change? Because a big cost for councils and education is bus travel to get to and from schools. And I know certainly, I can think just down the road for me, there's a number of schools where the service buses are running right past the door. So what is there implications for local authorities in terms of the amount of money it costs them to provide transport for under 18s getting to and from school? But my main point is, will you publish and ensure that local authorities and all the key stakeholders are involved as this proposal is being developed?
Well, the short answer is yes. But, I mean, it's worth bearing in mind that the comment that was made by Alex Rowley's colleague in the Chamber last week at stage 1, that Labour had assumed that rolling out bus travel to all under 25s would cost about £26 million. So, you know, I think we have got to make sure that we take people with us. We've got to make sure that we consult appropriately. And I don't think we would want to do this in isolation of all the other factors that Alex Rowley has rightly identified. So in terms of three initial work streams. One will be looking at policy and legislation, and that will have to include consultation and engagement with stakeholders. It'll include research and evidence being the second one, reviewing the options that are currently available around travel concessions and how we extend that. And then how we actually implement it, the operational implementation. And that's where it comes to whether you could potentially adapt the existing Young Scot card-based non-statutory young persons bus discount scheme. So those are the three streams. None of them can be done in isolation from local authorities and the bus companies. There's going to be extensive consultation and engagement. But ultimately, I think most of us certainly want to get to the same end point, which is to make it as easy and as straightforward for young people to use a bus.
What about school transport?
And what's the question there? I mean, whether this covers school
Well,
transport?
what local authorities, and it was raised with me again at the weekend by councillors in Fife, is that once for under 18s becomes free to use the buses, then will that include school transport, or will the local authorities continue to be expected to pay for school transport separately?
That's something that we would have to explore with local authorities. But where this makes a big difference, I think, is where young people are unable to get school bus transport. The most obvious one, the one that parents have raised with me over the last week, is when their child is doing extracurricular activities after school and can't actually get the school bus and is coming home later, and that's however much money, £3, £2, and that mounts up. So, these are all questions that will have to be explored with COSLA, and we intend to explore them with COSLA. Certainly this commitment should be in addition to what is already provided, and I think it's important that we have answers to the question, which is why we've given ourselves quite a significant lead-in time for next January.
I guess you'll want to ask some questions around this area as well.
Just one or two, yeah. Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I think there are obviously some questions here that are relevant for transport ministers to answer some way down the line, particularly the argument for a more holistic approach that Alec Rowley, I think, quite rightly sets out. I was getting off a bus the other day, and the driver called me back on and said, "When are you going to take us over? We all want to work for the corporation again." So I think there's a lot of appetite for those public bus companies, and that case will continue to be made. I didn't ask. Far too polite. There are two questions I'd like to explore with you just at the moment, though. First of all is on measuring the impact, and it relates to one of the questions that Alexander Burnett asked. Obviously, some of the areas where this can achieve both a social and an environmental impact is around reducing the cost of family travel, not just young people travelling on their own, but making sure that they can do that rather than their parents giving them a lift, or reducing the financial cost of families travelling together. So will there be an attempt to measure the social justice as well as environmental impact as this is played out, as we see it start to be implemented? And the second one is on how it's going to work. You mentioned Young Scot as one of the options. Would you agree that it makes sense to ensure that it's developed and implemented in a way that is then later scalable if a future Scottish Government was to decide to expand the age range or to expand the modes of public transport that are covered? We would presumably want to do this in a way that's flexible enough to do that, rather than having to design a completely new system to replace it if those kind of changes were approved later.
So in answer to the second question, yes is the short answer, because as I mentioned already, in light of the fact that we have a scheme in place for over 60s, it makes sense that we don't reinvent the wheel, and we look at what works already and are able to roll that out at the under 19s. So I think you would definitely want a scheme that you can work with. And particularly in terms of future direction. That's not me giving an indication of what the future direction is, but I do think it makes sense to to build schemes to get it right the first time and not have to reinvent the wheel every time you make a policy change in this area. In terms of the first question, which I think is absolutely brilliant, around how we measure the policy impact of these changes, not just in terms of one portfolio area. It's an issue I know that we've discussed in the past, and how you measure the impact of a policy which actually is delivering benefits in multiple different areas. So the example I've used in the past is around emission reductions and the impact it has on, in terms of the travel zones, in terms of the impact it has on health as well as on transport. So in an area like this, there's social justice, there is the health impacts in terms of prevention, there is a transport impact as well. And I think that the way we capture that at the moment is through the National Performance Framework, where we have one outcome and we're measuring the impact of our policies through those outcomes. And I think this policy can deliver multiple outcomes, not just a single outcome.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. The Sunday Mail this week reported that Scottish Enterprise staff had been emailed by Steve Dunlop, the Chief Executive, ordering them to freeze all future support grants and to slash internal budgets. Were you aware that Scottish Enterprise was running out of money when the Scottish Government decided to cut their budget for next year by 9%? And have the Scottish Government considered the economic impact of a reduction in the budget for Scottish Enterprise?
Firstly, I think it's important to say that the comment about running out of money is not accurate. Secondly, it's a point that I've made in the past that we want to ensure that investment that's going through our enterprise agencies is actually going into the economy. So I think it's perfectly acceptable for organisations to look at how to be as efficient as possible to maximise the resources that are being invested ultimately in the economy. And I think that's what matters. I think in terms of this year's budget, which of course is one of the first years that we're funding the South of Scotland enterprise with overall investment next year around 28 million, it's important to look at the investments that we're making in the economy in the round through Scottish Enterprise, yes, but also through the other vehicles as well.
It doesn't necessarily appear, Minister, that the transition to the South of Scotland enterprise and I think the Scottish National Investment Bank is working for businesses right now if they are not getting the support they need right now. Do you think it's acceptable and prudent for Scotland's leading enterprise agency to be freezing support for businesses in Scotland right now?
Well, I'm not aware in any way that there is a freezing of support going directly into businesses. I think every organisation needs to look at the way that it operates, and I would expect every organisation to look at the way that it operates to ensure that it's delivering value for money, ultimately for the taxpayer and for our public services. So whether it's Scottish Enterprise, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, South Scotland Enterprise, or the Scottish National Investment Bank, the priority is to ensure that the money that we're investing goes to the business or the organisation or the community group in some cases. They're the ones that are ultimately most important. And yes, we need to support those enterprise agencies to do that as well as possible. But I don't think you can look at this year's budget in terms of the investment through the Scottish National Investment Bank and through our different enterprise agencies and come to any other conclusion than we are investing in the economy.
Okay, thank you.
Question, Ali, in relation to Scottish Enterprise as well. Okay, in that case, I'm going to go to Murdo.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. When you came to this committee 3 weeks ago to talk about the budget, you assured us every penny had been accounted for, and now, of course, you found an extra £173 million. So I'm glad you located the missing sofa and that cash has materialised. I note that of that £173 million, £50 million comes on the basis of a reprofiling of non-domestic rates distribution over the period of the next 3 years. So is it fair to characterise that as you essentially borrowing this year against future income in the years to come?
The only issue I would take with that sentence is the word borrowing, because as Murdo Fraser will know, and I included the table in the letter that I sent, the non-domestic rate pool for ultimate and absolute clarity does not impact on ratepayers, and it does not impact on local government funding. It is bringing forward forecast growth to invest, but that does not in any way disrupt our plans to bring the non-domestic rates pool into balance, which is the table that was provided.
Thank you for that clarity. That's very helpful. You'll have seen from this committee's budget report that we highlighted the issue around the income tax reconciliations, which in the current budget we're discussing came to 204 million, and the current projected sum for the following year is 550 million, which is a much larger sum. I'm just wondering, therefore, how prudent it is to start spending future years' income in the coming budget when we know we've got this much bigger issue potentially to address in a year's time.
So, as I said earlier to the convener, this is a judgment call. So we have protected as part of this budget, and I have not touched in any way the reserve. So the reserve remains the same. And also I've left £93 million of resource borrowing headroom as originally planned in the budget. And that is because we are aware of the volatility and the uncertainties that are coming down the line. Now, that is part of a much bigger question to do with the fiscal framework. And my initial conversation with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury last week, in fact, I think he raised it, that we needed to discuss and ensure that the fiscal framework is working for both governments. I think that the level of volatility that we're currently seeing in income tax receipts is very concerning. Next year, our borrowing powers will not cover the 550 or so million pounds worth of reconciliation. So that is a question for the UK government. Figures like that, they are able to borrow, to cover and to smooth over. We do not have that capacity. So whilst I am making prudent decisions now to ensure that we have the headroom, as much headroom as possible next year, it's still not sufficient headroom through the levers that we have to deal with that level of reconciliation.
Thank you for that response. I would just observe that while, of course, there is the capacity to borrow, though albeit that's limited, that money that's borrowed does need to be repaid at some point, and therefore you are simply storing up additional issues for future years. But can I just go back to the non-domestic rates income estimates, which I note for the coming year are 2.749 billion, rising to 3.423 billion in the year 2023-24. Now, what that means is over the next 3 years, you're expecting non-domestic rates income to increase by £674 million. That accounts to, according to my calculations, a 25% increase in non-domestic rates income over the next 3 years. I mean, it seems to me that's an astonishing uplift in business taxation over a 3-year period, well above the rate of inflation. How do you arrive at those figures?
I'll ask Graham Owenson to come in a minute, but those are based on the most accurate forecasts that we have, led by the evidence. But Graham may have more to add.
Yeah, so those are Scottish Fiscal Commission estimates based on CPI inflation. You also need to take into account where we are in the appeals cycle, when appeals have been settled. So in the earlier years, when we're getting a lot of appeals settled, income will be low. In the later years, when the appeals have been now that the appeals have been settled, the income will be higher. So it's to do with where you are in the appeals cycle.
I mean, I think I understand that as a technical response to this, but what it seems to me is, at a time when the Scottish economy is not projected to grow particularly fast over the next 3 years, you're expecting to take from Scottish business a 25% increase in taxation. That's bound to have an impact on the competitiveness of Scottish business.
But the rates that individual businesses will pay will be no higher than CPI inflation increase each year.
So where does the near £700 million growth come from?
Well, it's a range of technical factors, but the main one being where you are in the appeals cycle. So in the earlier years, when we're in the middle years when we're settling appeals, income will be lower and it will be higher once those appeals have been settled in later years.
Yes, but overall, there'll be an additional tax burden on Scottish business of nearly £700 million over the next 3 years.
So those are technical answers as to how we arrive at the forecast. I think quite separately in terms of what business will see, next year, of course, Scottish business properties will be paying a lower headline poundage than the rest of the UK, and 95% of properties will be paying less than they would elsewhere in the UK. We still continue to have the most generous rates relief anywhere in the UK. So I think in terms of what businesses will see, they will see the impact, the positive impact of the most recent non-domestic rates bill in terms of the changes that have been made to the appeals system, and they will also see they will be paying a lower headline poundage than they would anywhere else in the UK. So I think we can continue to say that Scotland provides the most competitive rates regime to business anywhere in the UK.
Just one more question, Convener, if that's all right. I mean, there has been some suggestion in the media that the Chancellor will announce next week as part of the budget a fundamental review of non-domestic rates for England and Wales. Is that something the Scottish Government would look to consider?
I mean, again, those questions are challenging because it's all what ifs, and we've got to pin down our budget now. And the reason that we're going early with our budget is, of course, to give certainty to ratepayers. So I think you have to think very, very carefully about making changes which we wouldn't intend to do to rates and taxation in year. So I think that's very, very important to make that point. But secondly, I would say that we need to do what's right for Scottish business here in Scotland. And our reliefs scheme, which is the most generous in the UK, and the decisions we've made around headline poundage being slightly lower than the rest of the UK, and the fact that we have unique reliefs such as the Business Growth Accelerator, are all adapted to the Scottish business environment. So I don't think that necessarily means we just replicate what we see south of the border, because if we did that, then we'd have to get rid of a lot of our very generous reliefs.
Okay, listen, I've got a couple of people who want to ask supplementaries in the area of reconciliation and reserves, and I think one also in rates, kind of business rates. Can I go back though to the one that we had previously around the issue that Murdo raised around reconciliation reserves? John, you were interested in that area, correct?
Not for non-domestic rates, no.
Not for, but the whole issue of reconciliation was raised as well.
Well, reserves generally, yes.
You want to raise that now? I know Donald's also interested in that area too. But it's all relating to Murdo's question. So.
Yes, it was following up. I mean, I have to say, after your excellent speech last week, which I don't know who wrote it, but it was very good, about reserves, and the question of taking a kind of longer-term view to the Scottish budget, and should we be setting aside reserves, and this kind of tension. And you have answered in your reply we got yesterday about it's a matter of judgment and finding the balance, which I totally agree with. I mean, local authorities, I happened to meet people from Glasgow City Council on Saturday, and they have a 2% target, I think, the councils, as reserves. And I just wonder what your thinking is around that, because, you know, if we put money into reserves, that's sensible, that's wise, but it means there's less money available to spend today. How do we get that balance, do you think?
Well, I do think we've got the balance right in this budget, because it is a very important judgment call to make. On one hand, we've got to make prudent decisions in order to deal with future volatility, but on the other hand, any money that's in the reserve is not being invested in our public services at a time where, certainly within the Parliament, every party is calling on greater investment in different budget lines. So I think we've taken the right decision this year by leaving 100 million in the reserve. And I consciously had to choose to do that as part of reaching agreement with another party. I've consciously decided to leave that 100 million in. And I think that, you know, subject to what happens of the UK government, by the UK government on their budget day, my view would be that we do want to add to the reserve to increase certainly the government's ability to manage the volatility that's inherent under the fiscal framework.
I mean, have you any thought of a figure? I mean, would 2%, as with the councils, be the kind of figure you would ideally like?
I mean, it's very difficult to put a percentage rate on it, because on an annual basis there are a lot of things that are changing. we'll be giving greater thought to Parliament's comments about the reserve and what should be held in the reserve as part of the medium-term financial strategy, which will be published later this year. And that will give the sort of longer-term strategic view on how we should be managing volatility and reserves.
I'll just say to John Mason, I do like my compliments without barbs. So just watch where you are in terms of asking questions in future. Donald.
Thank you, convener, and good morning. Just returning to the issue of non-domestic rates income. Am I right in thinking that last year you considered this in the budget as an option, and you described, well, not you, but the government described it as an exceptional decision at that stage? Given that you're now doing this for the second year in a row, can we deduce from that this is no longer exceptional?
This is very much an exceptional budget in exceptional circumstances, and exceptional decisions have to be taken in terms of how we manage not just the volatility of the fiscal framework, but the uncertainty inherent in going ahead of the UK government on our budget, which is why we said on the face of the budget bill that we were baking in anticipated consequentials. I think what's most important in this regard is our commitment to bring back the non-domestic rates pool, and we will be doing that and meeting our target over the coming years, as I identified in the letter. Now, again, on technical questions, I don't know if Graham has anything to add, but you know, I think Parliament would have cause to ask more questions if it meant that the non-domestic rates pool was out of balance for longer, but actually our decisions are prudent decisions, I believe, and we will still see the non-domestic rates pool brought back into balance within the same timescale. So it's basically spreading the income over a number of years rather than just in the year in which it was taken. Incidentally, we didn't actually go into negative territory last year with the non-domestic rates pool. So we didn't use that last year.
Yeah, that was a point of clarification I was going to add. We forecasted the pool would be in deficit of a minus 100 million in 1920. In the event, the latest forecast is it will actually show a small surplus. So we didn't use the facility.
The point I was making was that you specifically described reprofiling as exceptional last year. I'm not just talking about the budget in general, but the actual policy of reprofiling was described as an exceptional decision. That was my first point. My second point is around this. You were plainly aware that this was a source of funds, not only because you mentioned it last year, but also in the draft budget, you made provision for £100 million worth. Is that fair?
I mean, for Parliament has to determine whether they would rather I use the non-domestic rates pool or saw £50 million worth of cuts to another portfolio line. And I don't think there's an appetite for that, certainly. So in terms of, Parliament's aware, I'm aware that the non-domestic rates pool exists. Our commitment is to ensure that it's in balance by 2022, I believe, and therefore that remains our position.
This was a supplementary, Donald, so I'll come back to you in other questions you got. I know Alec Burnett wanted to ask a supplementary in this area as well.
Thank you, convener, and I note members to my register of interest around someone who pays business rates. I wonder if you could explain a bit more about the cycle when you say that it rises by 700 million by 700 million to 2023-24 because of the timing of the cycle. But my understanding is you have to pay your rates every year, regardless of whether in your appeal or not. So can you just explain and maybe clarify? Is that 700 million the difference between successful and rejected appeals, or how is it?
Without being patronising, and I don't mean to patronise, it might be worth a technical explanation of how the pool actually works, because the non-domestic rate pool, I just need to clarify that once again, our decisions around the pool do not have an impact on non-domestic rates payers, and they don't have an impact on local government funding. It's about how the non-domestic rate system works in terms of how we smooth the access to funding that local authorities have. So as you can imagine, at the moment, and this came to light when we were having our engaged in discussions on whether or not to devolve non-domestic rates to local authorities, the big challenge was whether to devolve the risks associated, because at the moment, we as a Scottish Government, central government, take the risk of non-domestic rates. So local authorities will have a forecast for non-domestic rates of what they can spend next year. Now you can imagine if that forecast was not the same, which it often isn't, as what they actually take, then the risk would lie with local authorities. We don't do that. So we use the pooling system to ensure that local authorities have guaranteed funding from year to year. Now that means that some years a surplus will build up, other years you'll find that actually the audited returns are less than the forecast, so that we'll go into negative balance. Our commitment is to try and smooth the income over a particular period of time, which means that, for example, last year a surplus built up, so we didn't actually put it into negative balance. This year, in order to ensure we have funding to deliver on our negotiations, we have made the decision to reprofile non-domestic rates pool.
But still, your colleague Graham, in the answer he gave, talked about the appeals cycle and the difference in the appeals. And I just don't quite understand how that occurs.
So when appeals are settled, successful appeals will be backdated to the start of the revaluation cycle. So but they may be settled 2, 3, or even 4 years down the line. So that 4 years of appeals, successful appeals income, will be lost in 1 year.
So my original point in the question, that 700 million less CPI inflation for rates is actually the quantum of successful appeals.
Appeals is a significant factor in it. The other factor is that empty property relief is being devolved to local government from, I think, 22, 23. So again, that's another significant reason for the spike in the apparent income.
We're going into another area now. It's George, please.
Convener, good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I'd like to ask about the Scottish Police Authority budget, which is obviously increasing by £60 million this year. And we all know that the Scottish Government is committed to protecting the police budget in real terms. My question would be, does this funding exceed that commitment? And if it does, by how much?
So, George Adam is right in saying that the Scottish Government did commit to protecting the revenue budget of the police authority in real terms over the lifetime of the Parliament. So we estimated that that would result in a £100 million boost to the authority's revenue budget over that time frame. Following next year's budget, we have exceeded our £100 million commitment. And in addition to real terms protection in 2020-21, we're providing a further 25 million revenue funding to maintain officer numbers. So over the total policing budget will increase by £60.2 million in 2020-21, which is a 5.1% increase on the 2019-2020 budget position.
Okay.
Will you another question?
Could I begin with the Scottish Fire Service budget? Can you confirm that there is enough money in the budget to meet the pay offer that has been put on the table for fire service staff, personnel?
So the budget, in terms of protecting the fire service, we have ensured that next year we protect their budget and ensure that there is sufficient funding going to frontline staff. But if the member is referring to the current campaign that's ongoing, I don't know if that's what he's getting at in terms of how far that funding is going to meeting the pay offer, then I'll ask my colleague Ash Denham to write to him in relation to specific details.
Yeah, because I think the point there is that the pay offer, well, it's not a pay offer. As you know, there's a much wider offer on the table, and that has been rejected by staff. But the Chief Fire Officer has suggested that there is now a danger that there is not enough money within the budget to actually pay for the pay offer.
Bring that the Scottish Government's obviously not a party in the negotiations concerning firefighter pay, so that's a matter for the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service as the employer. But in terms of the funding that we have committed to, we are continuing our commitment to support the modernisation of SIFRS, and that means there's a further uplift of £6.1 million on top of the increased spending power of £5.5 million in 1920 and £15.5 million in 2018-2019. So we have provided £63 million of additional spending capacity in total over the last 3 years in respect of the service transformation, so that SFRS can do more to keep our communities safe. But I would stress that when it comes to firefighter pay, the Scottish Government is not a party in that negotiation.
Okay, thank you. Could I move on? There was a point that Patrick made that you welcomed around the policy impact of budgets. Last year, one of the headline budget announcements was the 50 million capital one-off, 1 year spend for town centres. As we move on to the next budget, how do we measure the impact? I mean, that was a significant investment that was widely welcomed. How do you, as Finance Secretary, ensure that that money was actually used, and what was the impact?
I mean, the simple answer is that although we provided that capital funding specifically for regeneration of town centres, because it had been highlighted as an area that needed investment, we then commit to giving that money to COSLA, to local authorities, and then they are allowed, enabled, empowered to spend it in the way that they see fit. So this is part of the big debate around ring fencing. We have significantly reduced ring fencing so that local authorities have autonomy over 91% of their budgets and how they spend their budgets. And I think it's important to allow local authorities to determine how it is spent, and they will be able to make judgment calls, and they are of course accountable to a local electorate as to how that is spent. So there's a sense in which, whilst we are keen to ensure that our money is used well and invested wisely, it's given to COSLA for them to determine how to spend it.
That was a big announcement last year to start to tackle town centre issues in Scotland. £50 million, a lot of money. And I would expect the government would at least have to have the confidence that something's happened with it. As a one-off, did it go into street furniture? Has it made a difference to our economy? I mean, where is the policy behind that? I mean, linking that the same, Angela spoke earlier about tackling poverty and inequality. But if you look at Fife, for example, Fife has a £10 million overspend in children and families. It has a £10 million overspend in health and social care. So the additional £6 million that is coming in from the additions that have come for the budget with the deal with the Greens, that money is going to be used to try and offset some of those overspends. Audit Scotland published a report last Thursday saying that in terms of the IGB in Fife, that the financial future was so unstable that something had to give, something had to... So where is the overall policy direction of the budget in terms of health and social care, in terms of children and families? Because it's fine to keep putting money into new areas, but if the areas you've already put the money into are overspending and not able to cope, it just seems a budget of initiatives each year. We no strategic overview of where we're actually trying to make the changes that are needed in our country.
So I've got two answers to that. The first is that local authorities are ultimately accountable to their local electorate for how they spend their money. And local councillors need to give an answer in the same way that each of us elected for our constituency or regions have to give an answer for how we use the resources that we've been entrusted with. And I think when it comes to government determining whether or not local authorities have spent the £50 million on the right kind of regeneration. That is ultimately a question for local authorities who are accountable. The second thing, in terms of the direction of travel, obviously as part of the budget process, we meet regularly with COSLA. They identify the areas of pressure. Those are the areas that we have tried to support them with in terms of increased investment. So you mentioned health and social care. That's why there's an additional 100 million going from the NHS, from the health portfolio into social care to support local authorities and IJBs that are dealing with the pressures of changing demographics, an ageing population, and the challenges that come with continuing to meet the needs that are there. They also identified issues in terms of inflationary pressures on teachers' pay. That's why we've invested in what we have in teachers' pay. So as part of the budget process, we meet regularly with COSLA. They identify where the pressures are, and we try and respond through the budget deal.
When John Swinney was your predecessor, he set up the Christie Commission, and at that time that was launched, and the whole approach to the budget was going to be policy driven. We were going to look much more at preventative spending in order to drive forward. Has that now just been ditched? Is that
not? It's still
so
very
where's
much
the joined up thinking then?
Well, I mean, preventative spend is absolutely core to our decisions around the budget, and I think you can see that throughout this year's budget. We were very clear on what our 4 strategic aims were as part of this year's budget, and you know, in terms of tackling poverty, in terms of tackling the climate emergency, in terms of investing in the economy, we have core aims that we are backing up with investment. But the other way of looking at this is around outcomes. And at the end of the day, COSLA, local authorities and the Scottish Government are co-signatories to the National Performance Framework. That is a very clear set of outcomes that we want to deliver on. And again, the real test of our spending commitments will be in how they deliver on those outcomes. Those are outcomes that we share with local authorities. So I don't think we're doing any of this work in isolation, and we've got to look at the ways in which investing in one area is actually delivering results and delivering benefits in another portfolio area.
I mean, with the greatest respect, Finance Secretary, when I asked you then how those objectives are going, how those objectives are being met, you seem to just pass the buck to local authorities and say councillors should be accountable.
Well, you asked me a question about whether or not I felt that the Regeneration Fund had been spent wisely, £50 million. But that is totally at odds with what Labour regularly criticise me of, which is ring fencing and disempowering local authorities and how they spend. So my point is that we invest in these funding pots, but it's then for local authorities to determine how that's spent. And I think you would probably be the first to criticise me if I was too rigid in saying how local authorities should spend it. Ultimately, we are accountable to the electorate for the spending decisions that we make, and local authorities are accountable, as am I, and as are each of us. But when it comes to outcomes, the National Performance Framework, which all of us are signed up to, is the way that we measure progress, and our strategic aims in the budget determines what we prioritise in this year's spending.
Tom Arthur.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. As a consequence of the deal negotiated ahead of the budget, East Renfrewshire will be receiving an additional 1.8 million and Renfrewshire Council an additional 3.1 million, both of which lie within my constituency. This is part of an overall uplift of £95 million. Can you share with the Chamber, with the Committee Cabinet Secretary, what the total allocation to local government now is, and can you contextualise that within the overall Scottish budget and compare with how it looks with local government spending in England?
So this means that the total increase in funding in terms of resource for local government is now £589.4 million, and that's a real terms increase of 3.9%. So that means that next year's budget delivers the highest annual resource budget increase in terms of budget to budget at £509.4 million for local government since this administration came into power in 2007. Overall, the funding increase, if you include capital, is £238.3 million, and that's a real terms increase of 0.7%. I often think the comparison is best captured in terms of what the finance spokesperson for COSLA said, which is that compared with England and Wales, where local authorities are collapsing, and that was a quote, here in Scotland, we're doing things quite differently.
Okay. Just as a final question, I appreciate you're very new to the role, Cabinet Secretary, but I'm interested in what your reflections are on the budget process, because we face significant strategic challenges in the coming decade, particularly around demographics and increased health spending. I just want to get a sense of what your reflections are so far on the parliamentary process and the way we collectively as a parliament go around the budget setting process, and if you have any initial reflections on that.
Well, I think we need to be realistic about where the challenges are and not to keep going back to the fiscal framework. But I do think that the review of the fiscal framework needs to be brought forward, because it means that we're unable to deal with the volatility as well as we could. Now, that may sound something, technical and boring, only of interest to the Finance Committee and myself, but actually it's about what money and funding we have to invest in our public services, which is of interest to everybody in this country. So I think that needs to be looked at to make sure it's not hamstringing our ability to respond to the challenges that we face. In terms of the budget process, obviously the budget delivers record investment in our health service, raising it to £15 billion. And again, we're committed to passing on all the consequentials that come to us for health to the health service in order to protect that. But questions are often raised, quite rightly, about how we ensure that we are taking a preventative approach. And I think that looking at this year, the way in which, for example, funding from the health service has been moved into social care is an obvious example where if we're ensuring that we're providing adequate social care, then it may actually reduce the cost pressures in other areas of the health service.
Okay, thank you.
I think I've got two other areas where people wanted to ask questions. Donald, you still got a question on consequential?
Yes, I have, Convener, if that's all right. Thank you. During the Stage 1 debate last week, Cabinet Secretary, you said again and again there was a lack of clarity and there was uncertainty around consequentials. Just as a matter of fact, firstly, do you accept that despite these statements and this professed uncertainty, your draft budget used consequentials, I think the convener mentioned at the start, of 468 million in excess of the Treasury's forecast of over 1.1 billion as per the spending round in last September?
We accept that £1.1 billion of additional resource budget was allocated at the UK spending round, to which we've added £142 million of anticipated additional consequentials from the forthcoming UK budget, and that's part of the overall 468 million, because the remainder is capital. The point that I've repeatedly made is that in seeking guarantees about that funding, officials at Treasury have consistently referred us to the Conservative Party manifesto from December. So we have based our decisions on the best available evidence, because to have waited until that funding was guaranteed after our budget was complete would have introduced even greater challenges to the budget. So the question really will be whether or not the UK government delivers on its commitments that were made as the election in December.
Okay, in terms, drilling down to last week's agreement, in terms of that agreement, you're funding this for the most part, or at least the majority of it, comes from consequentials. And I achieved that by a total of 173 million minus 25 million underspend minus 50 million of reprofiling. You get to 98 million, which appears to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, to come from consequentials. Is that correct?
It's not quite correct because of the fossil fuel levy. And again, it may be worth having a technical answer on that. I wouldn't characterise that as consequentials, because it's money that should come to us anyway.
The fossil fuel levy was in fact a type of consequential.
So it is slightly different. So this is a surplus that is directly accrues to the Scottish Government to the Scottish Bloc, rather than as a consequence of movements in UK spending, which then generates Barnett consequentials and comparable programmes. So it is slightly different but the kind of annual consequentials we receive through UK fiscal events.
I don't want to split hairs. It's just that in the answer you gave to the initiated question last week, it's described as an additional consequentials. But the point I'd like to make is that do you agree with me that it is hypocritical to complain about uncertainty around consequentials, as you did at stage 1 last week, and yet at the same time use or following use of close on £100 million of additional consequentials to reach an agreement?
I mean, the point around whether the fossil fuel levy is a consequential or not is quite important because it's confirmed in a different way. So your point, as I understand it, is it's hypocritical in advance of knowing what our guaranteed funding is. And this is the irony of this entire process, where we are going ahead of the UK government because we're trying to provide certainty to ratepayers and the public services. If we had waited until after the UK government's budget in order to get guaranteed certainty, the implications for taxpayers and for public services doesn't bear thinking about. So yes, I accept that there is increased uncertainty about our decision to come forward, but the UK government is perfectly able to guarantee our funding if they had so wished in the last few weeks. But all they've done is refer us to the Conservative Party manifesto. So we have based our budget on the best available evidence. Is it, as watertight as confirmation of block grant adjustments after the UK government's budget? No. But at the same time, there's all sorts of uncertainties that are part of our annual budget process, even in terms of last year's budget, where a matter of weeks ago, the UK government clawed back capital consequentials late in the year because there'd been an underspend associated with the policy decisions south of the border. So there will always be uncertainty.
I think my point is, it is hypocritical to complain about uncertainty around consequentials after you have in fact used £100 million worth of additional consequentials to reach a deal.
So my question to Donald Cameron would be, if the UK government, if the Conservatives fail to deliver on their promises that they made to the electorate in the December election, and therefore we see a cut, whose fault is that?
I'm not here to give evidence, Cabinet Secretary. You are. Can I ask you specifically about the consequentials that you referred to? I think I caught you saying that some of it came from local government funding in England. Is that right?
So it came from policy changes to do with non-domestic rates. So again, in advance of the budget, obviously no UK government minister is giving us any information on what they intend to do at the UK government budget, despite our repeated asking. So there was an indication that they were going to make some decisions and changes around non-domestic rates, and they had indicated that to local government, and that's where we got our information from.
Okay, so in terms of a funding settlement, it's not about additional funding from UK government to local authorities in England?
No, it's about changes that they're making to non-domestic rates, which you had to indicate to local authorities in England and Wales who are facing the same levels of uncertainty that we are. It's worth bearing that in mind.
Lastly, Convener, just on the fossil fuel levy, just to try and analyse this, there was no mention of it in the draft budget, I'm advised. Can you just be a bit more specific about the role of Ofgem in this, etc.?
So we were contacted by Ofgem with new information on the 18th of February, and that has informed our current position. And in terms of the fossil fuel levy, it's largely to do with how to apportion the surplus in the fossil fuel account. That money's always been there. It is our money, and Ofgem were contacting us about how to apportion the surplus.
John, I think your question, have you still got it around EU funding?
Yes, if I can, just briefly, thanks, Convener. I mean, I know that EU funding is not part of our budget, but we did, as a committee, refer to it in fair detail in our report, and you responded to that, Cabinet Secretary. I just wonder if you can say anything on the record about, have you had any indication from the UK government as to how and when, and will they replace the EU funding, for example, structural funds, CAP, all of these kind of things?
I mean, we and I share the committee's concerns regarding the uncertainty associated with that funding, and the serious consequences that there'll be from loss of EU funding. Now, the Conservative Party did commit to replacing certain funding streams as part of their election manifesto, but on this and everything else, we await further detail on the exact amounts, how those funds are going to operate, and when they will be provided. So we'll continue to push for clarity to ensure that there's no cliff edge from December 2020 onwards. But on this and everything else, we await confirmation on the 11th of March in the hope that it will come on the 11th of March. And if it doesn't, then we'll be waiting for the spending review.
Thank you.
Okay, that's been quite a lengthy session in terms of the evidence, very useful session in terms of information sharing. I think we should have a wee break for 5 minutes. So I'm going to suspend for 5 minutes and then we'll begin the formal process of the budget bill at stage 2. Okay, we begin the formal stage of the Budget Scotland Bill. And I begin with asking the question, is that Section 1 be agreed to? Are we all agreed? Yes. We're agreed. I call Amendment 1 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, group with Amendments 6, 7, 19 and 20. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 1 and to speak to all amendments in the group.
So I'll talk to all amendments in the group. So amendments 1, 6 and 7 in this group increase 3 portfolio totals in Schedule 1 in accordance with the budget agreement with the Scottish Green Party. Amendment 1 increases the communities and local government authorisation by £95 million. Amendment 6 increases the justice authorisation by £18 million to deliver the commitment to increase police resources, £13 million resource and £5 million capital. Amendment 7 increases the transport infrastructure and connectivity authorisation to deliver the commitment to provide an additional £60 million. So that's £15 million of resource towards the preparations of introducing free bus travel for young people aged 18 years and under, as well as the £45 million capital for net zero projects, including £15 million for local government. Amendment 19 updates the overall total amount of resources in Schedule 1, and Amendment 20 increases the total cash authorisation for the Scottish Government. So I move Amendment 1.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Any comments? No member making any comments. In that case, the question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We're all agreed. I now call Amendment 2 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, group with amendments as shown in the groupings. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 2 and to speak to all amendments in the group.
So these technical amendments update Schedule 1 of the bill to reflect the revised ministerial portfolios. So amendments 2, 3, 4 and 5 reflect the formation of the finance portfolio. Amendments 8, 9 and 10 reflect the formation of the rural economy and tourism portfolio. Amendments 11, 12, 13, 14 and 15 reflect the formation of the economy, fair work and culture portfolio. And amendments 16, 17 and 18 reflect the formation of the Constitution, Europe and External Affairs portfolio.
Okay, member want a contribution? No member wants to make a contribution. Therefore, the question is that Amendment 2 be agreed to. All agreed? Yeah. We are agreed. I call Amendments 3 to 19, all in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. Invite the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendments 3 to 19 en bloc.
Moved en bloc.
Does a member object to a single question being put on Amendments 3 to 19? There is no objection. In that case, the question is Amendments 3 to 19 agreed. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. The question is that Schedule 1 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We're agreed. The question is that Section 2 and Schedule 2 and Section 3 and Schedule 3 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We're agreed. I'll call Amendment 20, name the Cabinet Secretary. All debated with Amendment 1 and invite the Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved formally.
Question is that Amendment 20 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Agreed. We're agreed. The question is that Section 4 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We're agreed. The question is that Sections 5 to 11 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. The question is that the long title be agreed. Are we all agreed? And we are agreed, and that ends Stage 2 consideration of the bill. And I now close this meeting of the Finance and Constitution Committee. Thank you, everyone.